Understanding schools. The curriculum.
When we examine the U.S. pre-K-12 education system, the conversation inevitably focuses on the curriculum, what students are actually learning, and whether our current models are effective. The initial response to the COVID-19 pandemic caused severe disruptions to K-12 education across the country. These disruptions resulted in historic declines, or NAEP, and NWEA test scores. Researchers recorded significant losses at the fourth grade level, specifically in math, which saw sharper declines than reading. Data for middle schools was similarly alarming. A higher proportion of eighth graders student progress. They contributed to an unprecedented regression in foundational core subjects across all primary grade levels. However, these historic learning deficits were not distributed equally across the student population. According to NWEA data, historically marginalized students experienced significantly steeper academic declines. Students in high-poverty districts saw their performance drop much further than their more affluent peers. The achievement gap between the highest and lowest performing students expanded considerably during this period. The pandemic exposed a deep systemic vulnerability. Students with the fewest resources absorbed the most significant academic damage. Looking at the 2024 to 2026 school years, academic recovery remained uneven and complicated. While math achievement rebounded relatively quickly, middle school reading scores continued to decline. Recovery was heavily segmented by district wealth. Since 2022, the highest poverty districts, using federal relief funds, and the wealthiest districts, relying on their own capital, have shown the most improvement. A primary barrier to this recovery is chronic absenteeism, which constantly interrupts continuity. Before the pandemic, absenteeism sat at 15%. By 2024, it reached 23%. With a quarter of students frequently absent, teachers are forced to regularly reteach lessons, slowing progress for the entire class. Massive infusions of capital cannot fix an academic crisis when structural friction like high absenteeism prevents the curriculum from being delivered. A May 2026 report provided data that completely reframes the narrative surrounding pandemic-era learning loss. Analyzing decades of NAEP data, researchers found that learning declines began in 2013, 7 years before pandemic school closures. The pandemic merely accelerated a downward trajectory already underway. Data points to intertwined causes, starting with changes to federal accountability policies. A second driver is the ubiquitous rise of personal technology use by school-aged children. Finally, the report identified ongoing curriculum instability as a major negative factor. The findings are alarming. The U.S. education system spent the decade leading up to 2020 in academic decline. The pandemic struck a system already fracturing under a decade of ineffective policy and technological disruption. Complicating matters further, students continue to report that the daily curriculum feels disconnected from their futures, arguing that it lacks relevance and practical application in the current world. In response, many students have disengaged with school. The impact is apparent in higher education. Universities now regularly report that many incoming freshmen with high pandemic-era GPAs require intensive remedial coursework for foundational algebra and writing. In the professional sector, employers are voicing similar complaints. Metrics show that 30 to 40% of high school graduates lack the basic literacy and numeracy required for entry-level work. These graduates are also mentally ill-equipped with durable soft skills, such as critical thinking and workplace communication. Poor K-12 outcomes have moved beyond the classroom to become a direct threat to society as a whole. This crisis has contributed to a widespread loss of confidence in the system's ability to deliver college and career-ready students. For decades, American policy focused on the college for all model, viewing a four-year degree as the only reliable path to the middle class. Economists and policymakers are now pushing back against this one-size-fits-all approach based on current workforce realities. The assumption that every graduate is academically or developmentally ready for a four-year university ignores the reality of how students learn. The argument isn't that college is inherently bad, but rather that it shouldn't be the default assumption for every student. Critics are advocating for a pluralistic system that values and funds apprenticeships, credentialing programs, and two-year technical degrees as highly as the traditional university path. We're seeing the practical reality of these valued alternative pathways, which offer students direct links to the modern workforce. Many now argue that academic recovery requires moving past outdated assumptions and the restructuring of the education system for the practical needs of the current era. In response to the crisis, districts are aggressively rolling out new reading and math initiatives alongside emerging AI learning platforms. However, despite all this heavy investment in cutting-edge tech, student learning deficiencies are stubbornly persistent across the board. Digital platforms often function as high-tech band-aids applied over an educational foundation that is already beginning to crack. To understand the disconnect, it helps to look at the system through a historical lens as an institution and infrastructure. Finding the path to recovery means looking systemically at the culturally embedded practices and tools that define the system. The first major failure point starts at the very beginning of a child's life. Biological and cognitive development in foundational math and literacy begins right at birth, but the U.S. educational system traditionally operates under the assumption that real learning abruptly turns on the moment a child walks into kindergarten. This creates a stark pedagogical misalignment. Early childhood education curricula are rarely aligned with early elementary tracks, leaving a massive, unbridged gap between the two. Because the curriculum doesn't seamlessly connect, young learners are forced through a highly disjointed academic transition when they move into primary school. Before these students even formally enter the traditional K-12 system, this structural gap has already set them back academically. Once inside the system, students hit the second major failure point, the daily operational core of our school districts. There is a widespread systemic life after graduation. Compared to standard teaching hours, teachers spend a disproportionately large block searching for unvetted instructional resources online. Without a cohesive plan, teachers must decide what students learn, completely diluting the curriculum's coherence. When an operational structure forces teachers to patch massive curriculum holes themselves, it guarantees vast, unequal learning gaps from one classroom down the hall to the next. To fix these gaps, districts have recently turned to aggressive infrastructure upgrades, layering on digital tools and artificial intelligence frameworks to try and modernize the classroom. The flaw here is in the implementation. These digital tools are often disconnected from one another and entirely isolated from what other core curriculum actually exists. On a daily basis, this creates massive operational friction. Teachers are forced to endlessly toggle between unsynced applications just to handle basic lesson planning and student assignments. Compounding the problem, many districts lack clear, actionable policies on how to responsibly integrate these AI tools in the first place. Layering 21st century technology onto a fractured, uncoordinated foundation takes what should be a structural advantage and turns it into a chaotic administrative burden. Let's look at it from a macro perspective. This diagram shows three distinct failure points: early childhood disconnect at the foundation, fractured curricula weakening the inner walls, and unsynced technology short-circuiting the external wiring. With an architecture this unstable, trying to fix reading and math deficiencies through localized, temporary initiatives is guaranteed to fail. If we want to achieve real academic recovery, we have to be clear on the purpose of pre-K-12 education in the United States.
Thank you for watching, and we look forward to having you join in our discussions.